Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Faith and Arts Conversation. I'm so happy to be joined by Dr. Fahamu Pecou. Fahamu is an interdisciplinary artist and scholar who explores Black male identity in art, performance, and popular culture. Fahamu, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Let's dive right in. I would love to start the conversation with your interest in African power and ritual objects and how they relate to contemporary power objects like the Air Jordan 1. This is such a powerful juxtaposition. I was wondering if you could elaborate on this interest and your work with this.
Of course, yeah, I'm happy to. For quite some time, maybe even since childhood, I've been really fascinated by African objects, masks, sculptures, etc. For some reason, it's always been a real sort of, I've had a very sort of visceral response to these types of objects. And, as an adult, I began collecting them. And, as my collection grew, I began doing more like research and, study, trying to understand them and, have a deeper sense of their meaning, purpose, usage, etc. And, at some point I began to draw a correlation between, these traditional objects, right? And, understanding them within a certain kind of cultural context. And then asking myself, what are the, African masks of my contemporaries, of my culture, right? Like what are the sculptures and the masks and the power objects look like in my for my frame of reference, for my cultural experience. And it started to take the shape of things that may appear more as like popular items, like the Air Jordan sneaker that you referenced. The Jordan has become one of those kind of objects for me in my work. Thinking back to like I was maybe in middle school when Air Jordans first became popular, and and just recalling the magic and the power that came along with that, right? Like it was one of the most coveted items. I never owned a pair of Jordans until I was an adult, well into my adulthood, right? Because even as a kid in middle school, like if you had a pair of Jordans, you were special, and just thinking about like the way that particular sneaker silhouette continues to dominate sneaker culture and dominate popular culture. There's a kind of inherent power that, maybe was not the intention of the designers or even Michael Jordan himself, but the culture has attributed a certain kind of reading, respect, and reverence, right, for this shoe that makes it a power object, right? Like it becomes a kind of symbol of aspiration, a symbol of hope, a symbol of transcendence, right? Like it's the Air Jordan. It's supposed to make you have the ability to fly, right? Like it's supposed to make you have like superpowers essentially when you put this shoe on. And I think that there's something really potent about the way we imbue certain objects and certain things from popular culture with this kind of magic and potency. There's another term that I was recently introduced to. It's a term popularized by two art historians, Krista Thompson and Huey Copeland. They coined this term Afrotropes. And Afrotropes are these recurrent visual symbols and signifiers from African and African diasporan culture that continue to resurface and recirculate, right? Like, and every time it comes around, it has, that kind of, historical reference to the culture. But when it comes around again, it's expanded a little bit more and has a little bit different reach, right? And so I began to equate things that I identify as Afrotropes as being these kind of power objects, right? So another example might be, the Black Power fist, right? Which was first documented and popularized, in American popular culture in the I think it was the 1968 Olympics, when Tommy Smith, standing on the winner's block, put up the right fist, right? And so that became the symbol of solidarity, the symbol of Black power, the symbol of strength and unity. And it continues to be recirculated through Black popular and contemporary culture over and over again in multiple iterations. And it's similar to the Jordan, right? Like it's, recycled and resurfaced multiple times in multiple ways. I mean, it's been produced in so many colorways, I can't even keep up at this point. But it's a powerful symbol. It's a powerful object, similar to the way a mask or a sculpture might have been replicated to symbolize and reference a certain kind of movement, feeling, spiritual usage, right? Like all of these things that they're these correlations that I find really, really deep and really interesting and really engaging, honestly.
That's so inspiring. Thank you. These objects are around us all the time, and they really do hold this special power. And I think that this is a running theme with your work, as far as I know, going all the way back, of bridging the commercial world and also the fine art world. It seems like this is also so on top of this, really the significance of this. It's also, this is another larger part of your work. Do you want to say anything about those gaps, or that kind of your intention to kind of bridge those worlds, or even connect those worlds?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you for that question. I knew from a very early age that I wanted to be an artist, even before I knew what that meant. Right, like from the time I could hold a pencil and I could, and I saw the response and the reaction people had to things that I drew. I was like, I want to do, I want to do this. But I didn't grow up in an environment with art. I didn't grow up going to museums and galleries. The closest thing I had to a relationship with art was the cartoons, Looney Tunes and Flintstones and things that I used to watch on television. Like that was it. Outside of that, it was, watching the character J.J. Evans on Good Times, make paintings, right? Like that was my relationship to art. My relationship to art has always been through the lens of popular culture. It wasn't until I got to college and I got introduced to, quote unquote, fine arts and the canon of art history and all these kinds of things that I, saw that there was like a whole other world of possibility for this creativity that I had. And so in some ways, I feel like, having a reliance or privileging, this academic world of art, over the popular culture side of things would be disingenuous for me. Again, my relationship has been through, the popular culture and hip hop culture and street art culture. Back in college, I remember I had a couple of professors who heavily criticized my drawing aesthetic. They was like, "Oh, that's not art," But I came up admiring and replicating, like the street art on the T-shirts, like a Black Bart Simpson and things like that. So that's my frame of reference. And so when I have these conversations, or when I am making art, and when I say conversations, I mean the conversations that I'm having through my art, it's important for me to highlight and to elevate, these aspects of culture that are often kind of diminished or pushed to the side, or seen as, viewed as less than. And I think that that's, again, an important part of what I do and why I do what I do. I developed a concept at one point called trapidemia. It's a philosophy that I use that basically argues that what we consider trap, right, as in trap music and trap culture and all these things that are, associated with like contemporary hip hop, that this idea of trap is not an aesthetic; it's actually a technology. It's something that has long been used by oppressed and marginalized people as a way of circumventing the systems that have been designed to keep us oppressed and keep us at the bottom of the well, right? But there's so much dopeness and innovation and creativity and brilliance in this space is that like I argue that when we find ways to privilege and elevate and highlight these things, we might find new ways of navigating the world that we live in, right? Like we're no longer limited to these very rigid academic forms and frames that center Western or European ideology as being better than or superior to, other forms of thinking, other ways of thinking, other ways of being, which is, again, I think kind of draws me back to my fascination and adoration of what I call African cultural retentions, right? Like this is a completely different way of thinking about and navigating your way in the world than what we've been accustomed to doing from a Western perspective. And so for me, drawing parallels between, popular culture and the more academic forms of fine art are also about creating access and creating new languages for people who have been made to feel like they're less than because they don't have, that kind of frame of reference or they don't come from that space.
Sure. I thank you for that. This kind of is a really perfect bridge into my next question for you is wondering if you could share some early memories of spiritual practice and how it actually relates to some of the things that you were talking about in your art practice.
Yeah, for sure. I grew up in a small town in South Carolina. And there were, I grew up in a very strict home. There was only two places I was allowed to go: school and church. So I grew up, my social life was church. Um, I would often joke like, you know, um, when the doors to the church opened on any given day, when you open that door, I was already inside because we spent so much time there. Grew up singing in the choirs, leading Sunday school classes, doing all that kind of stuff. But the irony is, as much as I was there, it was really for me more of a social practice than a spiritual or religious one, right? Like I always had questions about the Christian ideologies. And oftentimes I would say, in Sunday school, I remember one time being like maybe 7 years old in Sunday school and they shared a Bible story with us, whatever. And I was like, but why didn't they do X, Y, and Z? And they were like, don't ask that. You just have to have faith. And that just never really like sat well with me. And so while I, practiced and performed in that space, it was never anything that like deeply resonated with me as being like, this is the thing. This is the absolute truth here. When I was in college, I began to, again, now I'm away from home and I have more autonomy, and I began to meet people who practice other kinds of faiths and, religions. And I was curious. And so I dibbled and dabbled in a lot of different things from Islam to, Buddhism to, other kinds of things. I was just curious, like, trying to find my way. But I always had a really deep, what I call deep spirituality. It wasn't aligned to a particular religious practice, but, I felt very deeply the presence of God. I knew that there were spirits, guardian spirits, protective spirits around me that were, helping move me to where I needed to go. And I didn't always have language for it. After I graduated from college, I began making these drawings and paintings of these faces that I would just see. They just came out of my mind. And oftentimes I would, put glass, mirrors where the eyes would be. I would put feathers into the work. I would make these little symbols and marks. And things like that. And one day, this must have been around 2002. I'm working as a graphic designer. I have my own design agency, and one of my friends who I hadn't seen in maybe 5 or 6 years came in, and he was dressed in all white. And I said, why are you dressed like that? He was like, oh, I just returned from Nigeria. I was initiated in Ifa as a Babalawo. And I'm like, a what? And he's like explaining it to me. And I recently hired a new receptionist. Her name is Orinike Odeleye. And she overheard us talking, and she came around the corner. She was like, you're a Babalawo? My dad is a Babalawo. And then they'd start having this whole conversation. And I'm looking back and forth between them like, what are y'all talking about? And so after my friend left, Orinike says, well, yeah, my father is a Babalawo. He practices at an Ile, Southwest Atlanta. Are you interested to go? I can take you. And I was like, yeah, let me check this out. I would love to see that. And so that following Sunday, which happened to be the first Sunday of the month, and which also happened to be the Sunday that was dedicated to the veneration of ancestors at this particular Ile, I attend with my friend Orinike. And, I remember we arrived at the place, and just outside they were like, you have to remove your shoes before you enter. So we took our shoes off, and I stepped across the threshold, and it was like, whoosh, like it just hit me. It's really hard to describe, but I just felt at home, immediately at home. Nobody had even said a word except for welcome. You know what I mean? And, during that service, it wasn't a thing where a preacher got up and preached to you. We literally sat in a circle, played drums, sang songs, and then in a circle in a real community kind of way, like the elders in the Ile began to talk about ancestor veneration, why it's important, what it looked like. These are the symbols. These are the iconography. These are the things. And as they were talking, I was like, I do that. I do that in my paintings. I use that in my work. You know what I mean? And I realized in that moment that here was the language I was looking for to describe what it is that I felt in my spirit, like my entire life. Right. And so it was at that moment that I was going to say I found Ifa, but Ifa came to me. You know what I mean? And it changed everything for me. It affirmed me in a way that other religions and spiritual practice had failed to do. And so, yeah, like that's kind of been my journey. And, if you look at my work, there's still to this day, buku references to Ifa and other African spiritual systems, which are often very, very similar. They have different names and, maybe a couple of little different sort of ritual practices that are slightly different, but essentially it's a very common practice across the African continent. And so you find a lot of references, and I find myself making a lot of connections, between, these different African spiritual practices, both on the continent and throughout the diaspora, as a way of, again, sort of privileging philosophies and ways of thinking, ways of being, ways of believing that have been demonized or vilified or, diminished, from a Western context.
Wow. Yeah, that's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that story with us. And, from every piece of work that I've seen of yours, it radiates this energy. And so thank you again. It's so great to hear that. And this actually goes right into this bigger question. It's one of these big questions that I heard you talk about before, but it's this idea of what is art? What is art to you? And how do you see it as an expression of spirituality, and if it connects to healing and to growth and to evolution?
Well, yeah, I'll tell this story, which I'm assuming it's the one that you've heard, and but I'd love to share with your audience. So again, as I mentioned before, I grew up small town, not really having experience or contact with the quote unquote fine arts or art as we know it. And my very first day of college at the Atlanta College of Art, very first day, very first class, very first thing that happens, the professor, his name was Larry Anderson, walks over to the board and writes on the board, "What is art?" I had no response. I'd never thought about that question before. I never considered it. And I listened to some of the other students in the class give their responses, and none of it felt like that's not quite it. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't. None of it was substantial enough to really be like, okay, yeah, that's the one. And so that question sort of like plagued me. Like it was like one of those little cartoon clouds that like followed me everywhere I go. I kept thinking about it throughout my career at Atlanta College of Art. But in my junior year, there was an album that came out by a rap group called Goody Mob, rap group out of Atlanta, affiliated with Outkast and the Dungeon Family, right? So the album comes out. It's called Soul Food, and I'm a big Dungeon Family fan, right? So of course I get the album and I'm listening to the album, and it's a banging album. Every song is a masterpiece. But there's one song in particular that really stuck out to me, called Guess Who? And on this song, all of the guys in the group rap about the impact that their mother's love had on them and how their mother's love rescued them, from calamity. I lost my mom when I was 4 years old. Tragically, my father suffered from schizophrenia and ended up murdering my mom in the presence of me and my brother and sisters. Growing up, we never had any kind of therapy, any counseling, any of that kind of stuff. We never talked about it. We never even spoke to each other about it, my siblings and I. And so after I listened to this album for what felt like hours on repeat, I ended up making this piece that I refer to as an inkisi, which is a very common power object from the Congo. Oftentimes you see them as a sculpture that will have like nails driven all through it, right? Like which are designed to sort of like be protection and to, contain a good spirit and to keep out negative spirits, right? So I make a version of an inkisi that is in homage to my mother. And it lives in this corner in my dorm room. I don't know why I did it. I didn't make it consciously. I didn't set out to make it. It just happened. And so friends would come by and they would see this piece and, would always arrest them. They'd be like, yo, what's that? And I didn't have language for why I was doing it. I I would loosely explain, but I never really felt comfortable talking to people about that piece or even that part of my personal history, because I didn't want people feeling sorry for me or, any of that kind of stuff. After a while, I decided that I would approach my siblings and ask them if they could write down what they remembered from that night, because again, we had never spoken about it. And I had my own memory, but at that point, I wasn't sure if what I remembered was accurate or if it was something that I, composited from movies and things that I saw on television, you know what I mean? So, I asked my siblings, they all went off and they wrote down what they remembered and they gave it back to me. And it was in that moment that I realized, one, that what I remembered was actually pretty accurate. But two, the level of detail, right, based on age was really compelling. And so I started using their stories to make, a body of work, their stories in mind to make a body of work that became my senior exit exhibition from Atlanta College of Art. And so the entire time I'm making this work, my professor, my advisor is like, yo, we need your artist statement. And I'm like, yeah, I don't really know why I'm doing this, and I didn't really have words for it. But ultimately, I finished the work. I installed it in the gallery. In the night of the opening, people, came to the opening and, people from my college, people from the community. And I could see people like respond quite viscerally, tears, people holding each other. People are, commiserating with each other, people commiserating with me. They're coming up to me and they're saying things like, I haven't spoken to my brother in 15 years. We had an argument and this work makes me want to reach out to him. And, men that I was abused as a child, and this work gives me the courage to, address that abuse. And, and it was really powerful. It was really powerful. But in that moment of hearing these testimonies from people and seeing the reactions from people, I was like, this is what I want to do. This is art. This is art. I want to do art like this. I want to make art that heals people, that moves people, that challenges and grows us, right? Like that. I don't want to make pretty pictures. I want to make art that does something in the world. And that's ultimately my mission to this day, right? Is making art that makes us better. In Ifa, we have a concept. It's called Iwapwele. It means to be of good character, to do good in the world. And so, like, I feel like the art that I make is my expression of Iwapwele, is to leave, to do no harm, to make the world a better place, one little piece at a time.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, music and art is a healing force for sure. And thank you for doing what you're doing and for sharing that with us. So your 2022 series, People's Instinctive Travels, it touches on themes of transport and access to time and space. And I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about those kinds of ideas and concepts as well.
Yeah, for sure. You just said it. You hit the nail on the head just a moment ago when you said music. Is a powerful form of expression. And when I wasn't making art, like visual art, I was making music. Growing up, I was always in choirs and church choirs and performing in talent shows with my cousins and my siblings. And if I wasn't singing, I was in the band. I played trombone. When I wasn't doing that, I was rapping with my friends, right? So music has always been a big part of my creative expression as well. And as an adult, like listening to music, I'm fascinated not only by like American popular music, but by world music. I love music from all over the place. I was joking with my wife recently about this. One of my favorite things to do when I go to France, especially, particularly Paris, is just sit and listen to the radio station because they just play the most random selection of music. It'll be like a 50 Cent song, and then they'll play like Nina Simone, and then they'll play like, Miles Davis or like, some kind of classical music. And it's just like, no rhyme or reason to, but I always discover these really brilliant, like musical gems in that. And music for me, it's always been like a physical experience. Like, when I hear a certain chord or harmony, like my hair on my arm literally stands up. I get goosebumps, and I've always felt like music allows us to, it's like time travel. I wish I could take a song like a Stevie Wonder song and break it down to like points on a grid, right? Like where the notes hit, and then overlay that over a map of the stars and see if that like is actually like if it actually translates to, to movement. Like if you play this song, you go to this place, right? You go to this constellation, you go to this period in time. I've always felt like music had that capacity to move us across time, space, regardless of where we are, when it is, and that fascinates me about music. It is a healing thing. It is a healing modality. You don't even have to speak the language to get the sentiment, and I love that. And so the People's Instinctive Travels series is my attempt at imaging that. And so throughout the series, you have these figures that almost become like deities, who have been able to use music, tune frequencies to, certain pitch or sound or harmony, and then travel to a place. And from those experiences, they collect something that becomes a part of their appearance, right? So, you know, it's a juxtaposition of time and space and fashion and culture, like even on their bodies. So they may be wearing a Cameroonian elephant mask and some, some G-fit denim and a pair of Jordans, but they're also wearing, bracelets from India and bells from South Africa, right? Like it's all a mass of like contacts that begins to shape identities that at first feel disparate, but when you listen to the music, it makes sense. It's like, oh wow, yeah, I can hear that harmony. I hear that rhythm. I see that, that sound. I feel that color, right? Like that for me is a really powerful thing, and I love to continue to play with music because it's a big part of my practice too. When I'm painting, I'm actually listening to all of these songs. I'm actually traveling to all of these places as I'm making these works. So yeah.
That's great. And frequency is color, in the color spectrum and all of these things. It does bridge us. You were saying the Stevie Wonder reference and, the Tribe Called Quest reference. It's all of these things compartmentalizing, or if you were to unpack and do an analysis, they do reference all of these different points in the universe and all the different points in the history of recorded history, and we can imagine all the other history to fill in the gaps. But it really is wonderful. And so the last question I have for you today, and this has been so wonderful having this conversation, is if you could share some of your insights and experiences with working as the founding director of the African Diaspora Art Museum in Atlanta.
Yes, of course, be happy to. Before I get to that, though, I did want to say one thing about music and to connect it back to an earlier point I was making about the Afrotrope, right? Like hip hop is a really great sonic example of Afrotropes in practice, right? It is literally taking a jazz riff that we're familiar with, sampling, reimagining, repurposing that sample. So you got that connection, but now I've taken it in this present moment to create something that doesn't yet exist, right? As a sonic experience. And we see that over and over again in hip hop music, especially, but I think in all popular music at a certain point that it references previous iterations of itself to create something new. Yeah. And so I love that about this idea of Afrotropes, but also more importantly about music. But yeah, it's a beautiful thing for sure. And yeah, for Adama, African Diaspora Art Museum of Atlanta, it's a new museum that I founded in 2018 to celebrate and highlight the African diaspora in the 21st century and beyond. The goal of the museum, one, was to establish a destination in Atlanta where people can go to find, experience, and explore contemporary Black culture. We have long touted Atlanta as this Black cultural mecca, but when you go there, it's like, where do you go to see it? Like, if you don't know someone or know a thing that's happening, then you could see a lot of Black people everywhere. But where do you go to actually experience the culture in a real like significant way? And so that was the impetus for starting Adama. I've been privileged to travel broadly around the world and, to experience various iterations of Black culture. And, in as much as there are similarities, there are also very unique and distinct differences that make it super, super, dynamic, right? And you can being in Atlanta for as long as I've been, I can see pieces of all of these different things happening, right? And so one of the things that was always fascinating to me was that no matter where I was in the world, whether that was Cape Town or Stockholm, I would always find myself in a room with other Black creatives having similar conversations about the challenges, uh, the triumphs, the beauty, the ugliness, the complexities of being Black. And I was like, I wish I could bring this to Atlanta so everybody, can see this, can experience this. And so we've been able to, create a dynamic space that is diverse and virtual, really. We've been touted as the museum without walls. Um, uh, because we, began our programming during COVID, and we did all of our programming virtually. And so we were able to, realize our mission of being a diaspora museum from the onset, right? So we were able to have conversations with folks in the Caribbean about, what's happening in the art scene there, and have artists, in Kinshasa, be in conversation with artists in Paris, and be in conversation with artists in Texas, and and have these conversations in real, like, in a real way. Now that we have a physical space, we're able to do that through our exhibitions as well. And so all of our programming, particularly our conversation series and public talks and things like that, we continue to do publicly, and then do virtually as well as in person. But our exhibitions, of course, they highlight artists and art experiences from across the African diaspora. Again, highlighting the fact that Atlanta, while it's has a lot of great things happening for it as a Black city, Blackness is not a monolith. And what we know of as Black culture in Atlanta is made up of all of these experiences of Black people coming from all over the world, and bringing their experiences, bringing their nuance, bringing their complexities to a city like Atlanta, which makes it a beautiful place to be and a beautiful place to experience ourselves.
Wonderful. Well, we'll drop a link in the conversation so everyone can find out your physical location and come and visit and join you for those talks and exhibitions. Fahamu, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights and experiences with us. Your work is truly inspiring, and I know our audience has gained a lot from this conversation today. So thank you again.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's great to be with you, and look forward to more.